described as a living national treasure. I'd love to say we have many living national treasures in the club, but we don't really, Geoffrey, so we're always delighted to see you. We have people who aspire to be living national treasures. He's also been described as our most prolific, wide-ranging, inventive living historian. He's a narrator of singular distinction. He's written authoritative texts on the economic and social history of Australia and published over 35 books, including well-received histories of the world and of Christianity. No simple local histories here, let's do the world and Christianity. Few writers have published for more than 6 decades, much less continue to display the originality and powerful insights of his recent works. Many here would be familiar with one of his earlier works, The Causes of War in 1973, which remains a classic. His wisdom has served the nation through many appointments: the Constitutional Convention, Australian War Memorial, Literature Board, Heritage Commission, Centenary of Federation Council, to mention a few. He's received numerous awards and honours, again, just to mention a couple. He was one of 5 intellectuals awarded a United Nations Gold Medal in 1988 for the excellence in the dissemination of knowledge for the benefit of mankind. He's received Australia's highest honour, being made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2000. He's been asked today to reflect on the impact of the First World War on Australia and the legacy impacts after the Armistice. He's also agreed to take questions from the audience. Please welcome Professor Geoffrey Blainey.
Members of the club, honoured guests, thank you very much, Richard, for the generous introduction. I was in Western New South Wales, I think, in 1982, and I was in Orange, and I had time on my hands because the plane was said to be very late. And I walked into a junk shop, and there on the floor, to my dismay, was a book I'd written. The proprietor came over to me and said rather aggressively, I thought, have you found anything there amongst that junk? I didn't own up, but I thought to myself, well, that bit of junk is at least worth $10. She looked me in the eye, she said, I'll see what it's worth, and she found in her pencil handwriting inside the cover $2. She said, $2 for a book by Geoffrey Blainey, you can't be worth that, you can have it for $1. Later she heard from someone who I was, and she wrote me a letter, a very charming letter, saying if she'd known who I was, she would have given it to me. So my name is redeemed in Collins Street. In 1914, when the First World War began, can everyone hear? Yes. In every corner. In 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, if you'd been a newspaper reporter or a politician and you'd ask all the well-informed people in Australia, tell me, what do you think will happen in this world war? There would not be one, no matter how prescient or well-informed, who could have told you the main body of events in the war, or even a quarter of the main events in the war. Which countries would be in the war, which new fronts were open at different stages. They would not know. If you said, when will the war end? Will it be a short war or a long war? The overwhelming majority would have said it will be a short war. In fact, in the last 100 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, virtually all the wars in which major powers fought one another were very short wars. In fact, there was a famous war in 1866 between Austria and Prussia, 2 of the 4 great armies in the world, and it was over in 7 weeks, very short. In Australia, of course, people had no idea. The great majority of Australians at the start were very much in favour of the war. I've read the debates in the Federal Parliament, which met in Melbourne in 1914, and there was nobody in the Federal Parliament who was openly opposed to Australia taking part in the war. A few of them had doubts, but they were careful not to express them or to express them carefully. So many of the events, even in 1914, were so unexpected. When the first convoy carrying Australian troops set out from Albany to where they didn't know, they eventually turned up in Egypt, but they didn't know that they were going there. They weren't certain how they should organise it. There was, of course, no transcontinental railway. It wasn't opened between Kalgoorlie and Port Augusta until 1917, late in the war. So when the New Zealand troops joined that contingent, there was no thought of sending them to Sydney and then by train to Perth or Albany. It was quite impossible. In Tasmania, they thought the ships carrying the New Zealanders to Albany, they could run into trouble. What if a German raider or German warship intercepted the New Zealand convoy and sank it before they even reached the war zone? At that time, Germany had a large navy, second to Britain, and Germany had many naval bases in the Pacific. They had a naval base in northeast China at Qingdao, a German colony for quite some years. In fact, you can occasionally go into the supermarket and buy German beer made in Qingdao. Germany had a colony in Rabaul, in that great harbour. That was a German colony. There were Germans, of course. Western Samoa, Nauru, a German colony, Pacific Islands. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, there might be a substantial German fleet. The fear was in Tasmania, what if the German fleet was quietly anchored in Port Davey on the southwest coast of Tasmania, no road to Port Davey? What if the German small fleet was anchored there and intercepted the New Zealand convoy? The Tasmanian government decided they would investigate. No telephone to Port Davey. They sent a small party, including Giblin, who later became a famous economist, Professor Giblin. They sent them first by train, then they went by packhorse towards southwestern Tasmania, and then they went by foot. They carried several big boxes with carrier pigeons. And when they reached the high ground, looking down over Port Davey, wondering whether they would see German ships, and wondering if the German ships might see them through field glasses, they went with extreme care. They could see no sign of any ship, and they released the carrier pigeons and sent them back to Hobart with the news. It was then, I suppose, radioed to the ships bound from New Zealand, and they passed safely on their way to Albany. One of the reasons that many of you here, I can see military historians ready to stop me any moment. It was widely believed that Germany would possibly win the war because Germany had proved itself the master in mobilisation, putting all your troops here and there, having trains working systematically and sending to the border with great speed. The German plan, called the Schlieffen Plan, was for the German army, and by the first few days of the First World War, Germany was fighting France on the west side and Russia on the east side. And the French plan was to knock France out of the war in 4 or 6 weeks, and then they could turn to the Russians. They thought the huge Russian army would take longer to beat. And so Germany took a shortcut through Belgium, and in a great circular route went very close to Paris. They didn't capture Paris, but with a bit of luck, they might have. The war then became deadlocked. Meanwhile, the Germans were fighting the Russians, and of course, that war went on until 1917, when the Russian Revolution pulled Russia out of the First World War. To the surprise of almost everybody, this war, which is expected to be so swift, with the German troops in Paris well before Christmas and France withdrawing from the war, it didn't happen. Suddenly, the war of movement became stalemated. People, except the very brightest experts, didn't realise that modern weapons, artillery, machine guns, were so deadly that if the enemy was in Little Collins Street and you were here, your chances, no buildings being there, your chances of reaching Little Collins Street without losing most of your men, exposed in the open air to this great blaze of fire, your chances of surviving were small. And so both sides went into the trenches. The trenches were shields. So here were these two lines of trenches facing each other all the way from the North Sea to Switzerland. And the war became deadlocked. It was so difficult to move from your trench and capture the first line of trenches of the enemy and then the next line, that the war was deadlocked for the best part of 4 years. Nobody had predicted that, in fact, the use of ammunition was so enormous that often troops in important positions ran out of ammunition. Some historians say that Britain and France at one stage of the war were really saved by Cincinnati in the United States, which was a great maker of machine tools, so important for making munitions, and they sent sufficient number of machines to Britain and France to change the shortage of ammunition. As many of you know, that's how Gallipoli came to be. The war was deadlocked. Instead of being over by Christmas, the war was static by Christmas, and the casualties were huge. We once went on a tour of French churches, and in many of the French churches were lists of people from the village who had lost their lives in the First World War. In so many of the churches, half the names were people killed in 1914, although the war went on to 1918. Gallipoli was an attempt, and other attempts were made in the First World War to get rid of this deadlock. Gallipoli was an attempt to open a new front where the war might move. The idea of capturing the Turkish controlled straits, the Dardanelles, very narrow straits, the idea was there of capturing the straits. The British warships could go right through and capture Constantinople. Turkey was fighting on the side of Germany and Austria. Unfortunately, Turkey then was regarded, Turkey was called in the newspapers the sick man of Europe. And Turkey had lost its recent wars, and people thought Turkey was on its last legs. The idea that Turkey would put up a great resistance didn't seem likely to so many of the experts, but Turkey had Germany as an ally and got a lot of wisdom from Germany. Britain took Turkey too lightly and sent a small fleet in the hope of capturing the Dardanelles and capturing Constantinople, Istanbul, and putting Turkey out of the war. Of course, the Turks were prepared and the British fleet failed. Then, of course, it was decided in Britain that, with the approval of France, that they must capture the one side of the narrow straits, and then you perhaps would have command of the straits. So Gallipoli took place. And Gallipoli took place on April the 25th, 1915, a great day in our history. Of course, the Turks, having warning that they might be invaded, had fortified crucial parts of the coastline of Gallipoli, and when the Australians and the French and the British landed there at the end of April 1915, they found very heavy firepower, and they all managed just to get a foothold. And even at the end of that year, they didn't have much more than a foothold. It's interesting, the letters sent by the Australians home, especially if they had children. They tried to describe the war in a way that the children would understand. I saw a letter the other day written by a Victorian soldier, and he said, "You can imagine where we are. It's like being on the beach at Sandringham." Or Black Rock, and those cliffs rising. course, that was a very gentle picture of what the size of those cliffs, but that's the way they tried to explain it. They fought there often with great bravery, but they didn't succeed. I myself think that we're wrong to call Gallipoli a defeat. If you land there and you fight successfully for 8 months, and then you withdraw this huge army without loss, you don't call that a defeat. If I was a football commentator and had to describe it, I'd say it's a drawn match away from home. Recently, historians have said it was a terrible failure and it should never have been attempted, but we do know that those Germans who were intensely interested in what was happening in every part of the war, as late as August 1915, said Gallipoli may be the turning point in the First World War. Von Tirpitz, the head of the German Navy, said, "I worry about Gallipoli. What will happen? It is Britain and France, Australians and the New Zealanders. What happens if they win and Constantinople is lost?" See, Russia had this huge army fighting the Germans, but Russia didn't have a very good war machine. Many of the soldiers in some parts of the year had no boots in the Russian army. Presumably that would be in summertime. It would be impossible in wintertime. Often they were short of guns, short of ammunition. If they'd captured Constantinople, they should have sent convoys of supplies through the Dardanelles, along the Black Sea, only a short distance, to Odessa and put new life into the huge Russian army. I think I'm safe in saying that Russia then had on paper the biggest army in the world, but poorly equipped. The other important thing about Russia was a great wheat exporter. The Tsarist Russia might not have been particularly industrialised, but it had a very powerful rural economy. And one of the advantages, if by chance the Allies captured the Dardanelles and Constantinople, that this great supply of Russian wheat could come through the Dardanelles along the Mediterranean to Italy, go if necessary to Britain. By 1916, 1917, Germany, for example, was becoming short of food. Italy fighting on the Allied side, Italy becoming short of food. In Italy during the war, serious riots in that peasant economy, serious riots about the shortage of bread. In Turin, many people were killed in the First World War, that great Italian city, because of bread riots. So it really was a very important, a very strategic part of the war. It was lost, but then so many other places were lost. I think some historians in Australia, they use the word now, Anzac-ery, for people who criticise people who had too high hopes of Australia in the war and too low an appreciation of what the Australians actually did. You notice that once Gallipoli was abandoned, that the Japanese became food and munitions suppliers to Russia. Japan in the war built up a very strong munitions industry, and although the munitions had to be sent on that huge Trans-Siberian railway from the Pacific coast to Russia, there was that powerful Japanese trade. Japan was one of the gainers from the First World War. Japan industrialised very rapidly in the military sense. So I think Gallipoli was very important. It was a failure. But if you look at the war and divide it into 8-month periods, Gallipoli was an 8-month campaign. Virtually every campaign in the war, in each 8-month period, achieved nothing. If you divide the war into 8-month periods, I mean, what did they achieve? What did they achieve in France in the first 8 months of 1916? What did they achieve in France in the next 8 months, 1916, 17? Look at the Russian front. Look at the front of Salonika. It was the kind of war where you didn't achieve things in the short term, and therefore to say because Gallipoli didn't achieve much, it was a terrible failure and a disgrace that doesn't seem to make sense. So the war went on and on. I think one of the valuable things about the commemorations in the last 4 years is that we've learned to appreciate that France was more important than Gallipoli, that the Australians who lost their lives, who gave their lives in France on the Western Front, were far more numerous than the Australians who lost their life at Gallipoli. I suspect if you took a poll of all well-informed Australians in 2014 and said, where did most Australians lose their lives in the First World War? I think, I could be wrong, the overwhelming vote would be most Australians lost their life at Gallipoli. If you said, what about France? Of course, people lost their lives there, but Gallipoli, that's when they lost their lives. And I think one of the important things about this commemoration is that we realise that the big proportion of Australians who lost their life in the war, lost their life in France, and were buried there. It's interesting the way the war turned. If there was somebody who kept perfect statistics and knew everything that was going on in every front, I think that person, if that person could ever exist, would have said in some months of 1917, and certainly in March 1918, Germany had the strongest chance of winning that war. In those periods, Germany was doing so well, especially after it knocked Russia out of the First World War. People thought Germany may win that war, and many people in high positions in Britain thought the same thing. Germany had great successes in March 1918. They no longer had to have that huge army fighting against the Russians. And the Germans had such great successes in that month that the Germans themselves thought our chances of victory are very powerful indeed. There are very good German records of what they believed would happen. We know that Kaiser Wilhelm II, what was he, the grandson of Queen Victoria, it's incredible, isn't it, the family trees of Europe of that day. Kaiser Wilhelm, the ruler of Germany, writing privately, of course, but his letter widespread amongst the German forces, he said, we are going to win this war on the present indications, and these are some of the things we will do after we have won the war. You don't do that unless you believe there's some chance of winning the war. He was very interested, he was very interested in the German Navy. He thought Germany must have new bases. He said Germany, at the end of the war, will take Malta in the Mediterranean, a great British sea base, and again in the Second World War. We will take Madeira. I think Madeira was Portuguese, wasn't it? We will take all the possible island naval bases we can in the North Atlantic. Germany then had a variety of colonies, all picked up in the last third of a century in Africa. We will, of course, keep those colonies, but we will take French West Africa and the Belgian Congo. So we will be the largest colonial power at the end of our victorious war in Africa. They, of course, also had plans for the Southern Hemisphere. Germany had a large part of New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, Bougainville in 1914. They were captured by the Australians late in 1914 and became temporary Australian territory. And the Kaiser Wilhelm said, of course, we'll take them back. Whether they will also have decided that they would take Papua as well, we don't know. I suspect they might have also taken Thursday Island for strategic reasons. But those were the kinds of plans that Germany had in mind if they won the war. Of course, he didn't have to say what he would do in Europe, where Germany would take if it won a fair bit. So here was the war that went up and down, and then it started to turn in the Allies' favour. By August 1918, it was turning very much in the Allies' favour. Some of that was due to the great success of Australians on the Western Front. By September 1918, it was fairly widely believed in England and France that they would win the war, but they wouldn't win until probably 1919. And then the German cause, and the German allies began to collapse. October especially. Austria-Hungary withdrew from the war. Turkey withdrew from the war. Germany was left fighting on its own. My own view is that Germany lost the war not only because of the victories over her in France and Belgium, but because of the shortage of food. The British blockade carried on so successfully, even when the German U-boats were so powerful. The British campaign was so successful that Germany became short of food. The main reason Germany was short of food was not only loss of manpower, but loss of fertiliser. Before the war, the great source of German fertiliser was from the west coast of South America, nitrates. One of the great sea routes in the world on the eve of the First World War was the sailing ships, and there were still huge numbers of sailing ships left in the world, but they would only take cheap cargoes. They came, the ships, a huge fleet of ships from Europe to Newcastle in ballast, no cargo. In fact, there's an area of Newcastle Harbour where you see Chilean plants growing because these ships went on with coal from Newcastle to South America being short of coal. Then they took nitrates. They couldn't go through the Panama Canal. It was only built just before the war in any case, so it wasn't for sailing ships. They went round Cape Horn and took the nitrates to Germany. That was the essential fertiliser for the German fields. Germany became shorter and shorter of food, and by late 1917, food rationing in Germany was very severe. No food rationing. In Australia, of course, we had far more food than we could use. Our problem was we had no ships to take it away to our old customers. I think one of the reasons Germany lost the war was food became so short that morale slipped very badly, and soldiers going home on leave, you know, the European powers that had troops fighting there, if they were successful, they could send large numbers of troops home on leave. We couldn't in Australia. So people in the German army knew that their civilians at home were doing very poorly. The troops had enough to eat, not the people at home. And so I think the blockade was as important in taking Germany out of the war as was the battles of the Allies in France and Germany. The news of the armistice came. I haven't got a script, so I've got to watch, which I have to watch. The news of the armistice reached Australia 100 years ago today. It was a Monday. People thought the war might end soon, but they weren't sure. They'd had false alarms earlier. The news, wireless was becoming more important, but I think the first news reached Australia by the cable, this undersea cable across the Pacific. Melbourne was the federal capital. The federal parliament met in the Parliament House, still in Spring Street, and the news reached Melbourne, I think, at 4:20 or 5:20 in the afternoon. I don't know how the news spread. The two main Melbourne morning papers, who were getting ready their next day's edition, were the Argus and the Age, and both had their offices in the pit of Collins Street. As the custom was in those days, late news from the war was put up on the walls of the newspaper office, and people going past could see it. There was no radio, of course. There were no, most of the people didn't have telephones. Even in my childhood, most people in Australia didn't have a telephone. So the word was presumably sent around Melbourne by word of mouth. And in no time, people poured into the city in large crowds. And of course, they did the same when the news reached Sydney and Brisbane and Perth, Hobart and other cities. The jubilation was intense. We can't be sure how the people who'd lost son or sons, fathers, brothers, uncles, nephews in the war, what they thought when the news came through, will we go and celebrate, or should we celebrate? Perhaps that we haven't got the heart to celebrate, much as they wanted victory. Federal Parliament met the next day in Spring Street. The acting Premier, I think we had an acting Premier in Australia because Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, was away for so long. His name was Willie Watt, W.A. Watt. He was a Victorian. He rose to politics through the Australian Natives Association, very powerful, still surviving in that organisation called Australian Unity. Willie Watt made a speech. He said, the war is over. We feel so grateful. We offer our thanks to all the Australian soldiers who gave their life in the just cause, and in the end he said, I must say something feeble as those words will be about the women. He said, we have to pay tribute to the women of Australia. And he used one of the words, I think courage and determination. The other word he used was fortitude. It's gone out of favour, hasn't it, as a word. I don't think I've ever used the word fortitude. It's just fallen from favour, and fortitude was the word he used to describe the women of Australia. There are a lot of records of the Australians. There were still about 160,000 Australians in Europe, in Western Europe, and who'd been fighting most of them been fighting within the last 6 weeks. Some of them, when they received the news, were just quite passive. They'd had enough of it all, and so this is the news. Inwardly grateful, but what could you say? Others of them were jubilant. There are accounts in some of the French villages of Australians climbing the steeples of the churches and putting the flag, the flutter on the top of the steeple. The war was over. General Monash had the task of demobilising them. General Monash had been responsible for one of the great Australian victories, and in fact one of the important military victories of the war. He moved over from the battlefield, suddenly quiet, and had his office in London. He arranged the demobilising, the sending home of 160,000 men. In those days there were no huge passenger ships except the Cunard liners, which are not huge by today's standards. So much shipping had been lost in the war that it was a great task to charter ships to send this number of people home. But he did it, and the Australians began to come home, as you would say, like Brown's cows in the old language. Occasionally you hear people saying, or you did, they're now dead, in the country towns, the word would get around that 4 of their soldiers were coming back in the up-country train. We had friends who lived at Kangaroo Flat near Bendigo. He said the news reached Kangaroo Flat that 4 Kangaroo Flat boys were coming back safe and sound from the war. They said, and Kangaroo Flat was then a small outpost of Bendigo, they said the crowd on the railway station and outside in Kangaroo Flat was such a crowd as Kangaroo Flat's oldest residents couldn't recall. And the soldiers, of course, were cheered to the echo. They came, most of them were brought back within a year. It was a slow process. John Monash himself returned, I think on Boxing Day 1919, which would have been 14 months almost since the war again, and so the task was over. People called it the war to end war, and it had been such a costly war. So many people, so many millions killed, civilians too in the countries that were invaded, so many soldiers suffering wounds, serious or not so serious, so many soldiers suffering from a condition which was then called shell shock, but now is called trauma or some such word. There was no medical way of, I understand, treating it adequately in those days, and so the casualty lists were very long. A big part of the federal budget, year after year, was henceforth devoted to pensions, looking after war widows, looking after orphans, repat hospitals, and so forth. It was part of the price of the war. The tragedy, of course, people thought we fought this terrible war. There must never be a war like it. It was far and away the most disastrous war in all recorded human history. And the peace movement was very powerful. And large numbers of people in so many countries joined the peace movement in the hope it had the answers. I think it's a terrible thing to say because peace movements are useful and important, but I think the first peace movement did great harm. The peace movement was most powerful in Britain of all the countries. There, people after people said we must never have another war like this, and one of the reasons why Britain in the 1930s, when Germany began to rearm, did not rearm rapidly enough, was public opinion said we mustn't have another war. It would have been far better if the peace movement was in Germany, where it was banned. And Germany was busy rearming, than in Britain, where the peace movement inhibited rearming. I don't say that in any way wishing to cause offence to the peace lovers of that period, but that was one of the sad effects of the war. I must finish, I suppose questions will raise interesting things. Australia was one of the inaugural members of the League of Nations, and Germany wasn't in it, and Russia wasn't in the first League of Nations. The United States, Woodrow Wilson virtually having been the great promoter of the League of Nations, the United Nations didn't join it. I think that was a disastrous thing to do. The United States was beginning to pull its weight on the Western Front, had several million troops there, and the threat of what the United States might do as its number of troops increased was loud and strong, but the United States, of course, also promised Germany a soft peace. Having done all this, the United States withdrew from Europe. And if the United States had said, we played our part in winning the war, we must make sure that we retain victory, it would have been very difficult for Hitler to rearm. I think isolationism in the United States did enormous harm to the Western world and to Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. Since, of course, 1941, the United States pulled its weight in the world, and I think in the period between 1945 and the end of the Cold War, the United States played a crucial role in the world, and the fact that we didn't have another major war. I'll just finish with the United Nations and how simple the world was. Australia decided to enter the United Nations. Billy Hughes was the Prime Minister. He came back eventually, and of course he fell out with Willie Watt, the acting Prime Minister. That's what you do, isn't it, when you've been away and the cats are around? Both good men, and Hughes is now attacked especially by Labor supporters because he left the Labor Party and became the leader of what we would now call the Liberal Party. Hughes had great foresight. I think Hughes was the only leader in the British Commonwealth who said Japan is going to become a great military nation. Japan is going to become a great military nation, a great naval nation, and if Australia is not careful, we'll suffer. It was Hughes who fought hard and won for the right for Australia to take over German New Guinea, the Mandated Territory. It would have been a great blow to Australia if in the Pacific War, beginning in 1941, Rabaul was a German naval harbour. Australia decided to join the United Nations. They thought, well, it probably won't do much in its first meetings. We'll send the Secretary of Australia House in London. Some people said, well, that's not very sensible. You've got to send somebody more important. There was at that time a backbencher named Stanley Melbourne Bruce, a Melbourne boy, brought up opposite the Melbourne Cricket Ground, went to the Melbourne Grammar School, then went to Cambridge, where I think he rode in the successful Cambridge crew in 1904. He continued to live in England. Like so many Australians who were in Britain in 1914, they enlisted in British regiments. He went to Gallipoli with the British and I think, was wounded twice and won the Military Cross. And he was then the member for Flinders, which was partly Frankston, Dandenong way, but then way out into the country. And Patterson, Lang and Bruce, his firm, Flinders Lane, wasn't doing very well, and he decided he would go over to England and see if he'd fix things up. No aircraft, so you had to go by ship. 7 or 8 weeks you had to come up by ship. You had to do your business, so he was likely to be away for the best part of the year. A member couldn't really do that these days. So away he went, limping from his war wounds. He did his business in London. His family firm were importers of cloth goods. He did his business in London. He loved golf. His father was the founder of the Royal Melbourne Golf Club. So he thought he'd like to play golf. So with his wife, he went to France to play golf before he caught the ship from Marseille home to Australia. When the Australian government said, Mr. Bruce is over there, an ex-serviceman, he's just the right man to represent our nation. So where was he? He left London, they didn't know where he'd gone. But they sent messages to various places. And he was in Dieppe, on the French coast or somewhere nearby, staying in a hotel. And he'd taken with him to Europe, he was wealthy, his own car, a Sunbeam car, I think, from memory, with a Melbourne-made body. And the man in the garage had married a French girl. He was an Australian. And he said, this is strange, a Melbourne-made car in our little French township. And he passed the word around, and the word reached London. And so Mr. Bruce was reached, perhaps at the golf course. And they said, will you go and represent our nation at the opening of the League of Nations in Geneva? He said, yes, very happy to. I suppose they drove in this Melbourne car. He caused quite a stir there, not a great orator, but a good speaker. And he was a survivor of the war. Of course, most of the people there were professional politicians. He did very well. He came back to Australia, and by 1923, Billy Hughes had made more enemies than he could manage with, and Stanley Melbourne Bruce became Prime Minister, and was Prime Minister from 1923 to 1929. Irrespective of what you think of his politics, he was a very competent man. He was the first Prime Minister in Canberra. The lodge was built for Mr. Bruce. He then did something very important. After he lost his seat, and like Mr. Howard, he lost his seat while Prime Minister at the 1929 election, which the Liberals lost and Labour won. And he went then to live in England. And he became very prominent in the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations. And in, I think, 1936, he was chairman of a conference at Montreux in Switzerland of the big powers, he in the chair. And they said, the problem is, what do we do with the Dardanelles? Fought over in 1915. What do we do with the Dardanelles? How do we prevent it? That's most strategic strait, perhaps in Europe. How do we prevent it being a cause of war? And they agreed that it should never be used by aircraft carriers. Never. They all said yes. And it never has been used by aircraft carriers. It could only be used by the Turkish Navy under strict rules. It could only be used by Russia under strict rules. And remarkably, those rules have prevailed to this day. So he did something very useful after he began that venture in his Sunday motor car. I pay tribute to all those serving today who have served their country. We all pay tribute to those who left their shores hoping to return and did not return. We owe them a great debt. I think it's always moving to hear those lines recited today by Lawrence Binyon, isn't it? They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. It's a great sentiment. And I like that later on, and the verse is not so widely known, and I hope I should have looked it up, I remember it correctly. He likened in one of his later verses of that poem, Lawrence Binion, to the Australian soldiers or the British and Australian soldiers who died in the war. They were like the stars, eternal. They're dead, but their light will never be dimmed. And I think it goes something like that. Just as the stars shall be bright when we are dust, moving in marches across the heavenly plains. It's a lovely description of the sky, night sky, moving in marches across the heavenly plains. And then it goes on to say, they shall be bright in the time of our darkness, but to the end, they remain. It's a wonderful tribute to those who went away from home and never came home.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree with me that we've been blessed this afternoon. Now, we've got the opportunity for a few questions to Professor Blainey. There is a microphone somewhere in the room, or perhaps two. So I'd ask that you would indicate your desire to ask a question. I'll give you the sequence. If you would please stand, introduce yourself by name, and we'll just see how we go. So the first question over here.
Gawley. Professor, how do you explain the lapse in Germany's satellites after World War I agreeing the surrender? I've mentioned Bulgaria and her companions, but it seemed to take a couple of years before the balance of, other than the great powers, took on the surrender terms.
Are you talking about the period 1918-1920 or just before 1918?
After the war.
Yeah. Interestingly, if I may make this a slightly broader question, in our mind's eye we think that when the Armistice was signed in the early hours of November the 11th, 1918, that brought peace to Europe, and of course the peace treaty still had to be negotiated in Versailles and Paris, and that took another 18 months, but so many problems the war didn't really solve. It solved the problem of whether Germany was stronger or weaker than Britain and France. Conflict after conflict broke out soon after the war formally ended. On the Armistice Day we commemorate now, we know that Britain sent a force to North Russia, to the White Sea, which froze over for a considerable part of the year to try to help the anti-Bolsheviks. I think that's right, isn't it? And we know that two Australians, you have only one, but I see the Australian yesterday brought out a picture supplement of two Australians won the Victoria Cross in that small British army that fought fairly close to Archangel. One was named Arthur Sullivan, a bank clerk from South Australia, I think enlisted at Gladstone, served in Broken Hill, then at Maitland in the York Peninsula, then arrived in the Australian Army in Europe just when the war was ending. So didn't fight there, and then joined this British group. And he committed an act of remarkable bravery and way at the back of Archangel and was awarded the Victoria Cross. And I see in the paper yesterday, I didn't know this, another Australian named Pierce. Isn't Pierce? Also won. He died in that same group. Only two Victoria Crosses were won in that little campaign, and the two were Australians. Before long, Finland was fighting the Soviet Union. Poland was fighting the Soviet Union. Latvia briefly declared war on Germany. Ireland was in serious trouble. Eventually, the Irish became independent in 1922. All over Europe, there were wars and half-wars, and they went on and on. Greece fought Turkey. Turkey didn't really expand, and when Ataturk became the leader in Turkey, he had an army ready made, and the Greeks and the Turks had a very deadly war, which the Turks began to win. And Britain decided that they would have to send an army to the Dardanelles to try to restore the peace. They sent a wireless message, I assume, to Mr. Hughes in Parliament House in Melbourne, said that, will Australia join us? Hughes accepted, but in the end he didn't. But it gives you an idea of what a commotion there was in Europe, and especially affecting places like Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth. It just remained a chaos. We know that in 1923, an Italian general and 3 other Italians were murdered in Greece, and Mussolini, newly in power, sent an Italian naval force to Corfu, the Greek island. Some of you have been there. Bombarded it and captured it and occupied it for a month. The war was the wars were very difficult to stop, weren't they? In other words, a war as big as that can't in itself solve all the enmities and problems, some of which it's created, some of which were there long before the war, unchallenged.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey, for your talk. Can I ask a question about commemoration and how that's changed? I was very struck this year to find that more of the poppies were enamel than the good old-fashioned cloth poppy, and I do miss the green, bit of green wire and so forth. And that also brings me to think about what we now do in Australia in terms of commemoration, both Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, Armistice Day. And I guess I've always been struck by the dignity and simplicity of the cenotaph in London versus how it's celebrated here. Do you think that's changed a lot in the period, and is there a chance we can go back to something simpler?
Well, the War Memorial in London is very simple, isn't it? You can put it up with a couple of Italian concreters in a week. It's the simplest memorials. We built the War Memorial in Canberra on quite a lavish scale for a small country, but it's the equivalent in some ways of the British War Museum, isn't it? It's both a museum and a memorial. I was on the council of the War Memorial for 7 years, and I'm a bit perturbed about the War Memorial's attitudes. Don't put this down on your camera. I've got a camera there. He climbed up the wall. I was on the council of the War Memorial. I must say I was astonished when, before I joined the council, that they brought back their unknown Australian soldiers from Brentno, took him out of his grave and put him in the War Memorial in Canberra with service of great dignity. And Mr. Keating made a speech. Some say the historian Don Watson wrote it. I suspect he did. It's really a most eloquent speech. It's a wonderful speech, but so full of propaganda that I'm surprised that it's on the prominent place by the unknown soldier in Canberra. It says we don't know what his occupation was. We don't know what state he comes from. We don't know whether he's married or single. We don't know. We don't know his religion, and we do know his religion. We know because of the 1911 census that at least 96.4% of the Australian population were Christian, 0.4% were Jews, and another 2% we don't know about, and presumably they were overwhelmingly Christian. So that this was one of the most Christian countries in the world, and you take his body from consecrated ground, where he had a religious burial, and you put him in the War Memorial in unconsecrated ground. when I was on the War Memorial Council long enough and looked around and saw who my potential allies were, I said, this is outrageous. We wouldn't do this to an Aboriginal, take him out of ground of spiritual significance and put him somewhere else without ceremony. And this is what we've done. Fortunately, the chiefs of the armed services at that time always attended war memorial. We didn't have a war, always attended war memorial meetings. They agreed. And so quietly it was put, the words, I said, we'll put the words that are on there too. And Philip Bretnow were there. No, nothing was known to God. No, and they've been put there in Canberra. But the speech by Mr. Keating is still there, and the speech also gives a strong impression that most of these Australians didn't particularly know what they were up to. They went away for a good time. They went away for a good time, some of them. And some went away with a strong sense of duty, but they believed on the whole in their cause. They believed they were fighting for a just cause, and I think there's a tendency now in Australia to say they weren't really fighting for a just cause. And hence they don't even talk much about the victory. I really think part of our commemoration is not quite right. But of course it's getting a lot of money, and it's a very popular place, but the ignorance of the public about the First and the Second World War remains profound. Although that's one of the most popular tourist attractions in Australia. So something's missing. And the school teachers present may know what it is.
Geoffrey, I'm going to ask a question and indulge myself. The notion that the Great War somehow gave birth to the Australian national character, I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
My own view, and some of you may disagree, I think that there was a strong sense that there was a place Australia with its institutions and its emerging culture that was different to that of the British Isles from which most Australians of those generations had come. The fact that the 6 colonies, now we call them states, came together in 1901 to form a federation, to form one nation, a Commonwealth, was a sign that people believed that there was an Australian country, and that if it was going to defend itself, it had to ultimately become self-reliant. Even in the late 19th century, Australia, I think, was probably the first nation in the world to become obsessed with spectator sport. And spectator sport is very nationalist. And you can see in sporting contests by the 1870s, 80s and 90s, Australians are very nationalist, although we didn't play many sports against other nations. And cricket was the main one. There was virtually no rugby matches against other nations. All Australian rules couldn't play against other nations except Tasmania. Soccer was very weak, but it was a nationalist country in very many ways. And if you read Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson's, they're patently nationalist, and they have a very wide following. But Gallipoli was important in extending and widening nationalism. Australians had previously fought in the Sudan War in 1985. New South Wales fought there, but they arrived really too late, didn't they? And Australians fought in the Boer War. Big numbers of Australians fought in the Boer War, and many of us have relatives who died in the Boer War, or know others who, members of the family who died in, related families who died in the Boer War. But the First World War, Australia, especially the way its soldiers were positioned at Gallipoli, came as a distinct group. They were distinct from the British. A lot of the time they were quite distinct from the New Zealanders, and they fought very well. And they gained the world's headlines. They were believed to be very courageous, and those Australians back at home reading the newspapers felt proud that their country had performed well in what really, in world terms, was a match of the day. And that gave them great pride. And I don't think that generation of Australians looked on Gallipoli as a defeat. If they were pinioned and they said, well, maybe it was a defeat, they would have said, well, it wasn't a spiritual defeat. It was a victory of courage. And so I think Gallipoli is important, but I myself don't see it as the beginning of the sense of nationhood or national identity, but it was very important, and I don't think there can be much doubt about that. What do you think?
Professor? Professor Blainey, thank you. I wondered if you had a comment about the military leadership, because it seems to me that the lessons, mankind didn't learn the lessons that were probably obvious in terms of the style of warfare, and you described it so eloquently in terms of Little Collins Street versus Collins Street and charging up the hill against reinforced machine guns in concrete turrets, and that goes back to the American Civil War and probably earlier than that. And it seems to me that the way that the leadership just didn't have a proper regard for the value of human life, and the leadership of both sides in that war seemed to contribute so significantly to the loss of human life.
Yeah, it's widely said, isn't it, that I think they said, whether rightly or not, of the British Army more than the Australian Army, that there was inadequate care for the life of the people whose life they controlled. And it was probably even more true of the German army and the Tsarist army in Russia. After all, Australia was a democracy. We're one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world. And here were soldiers themselves, for the most part, voters. It was their democracy, and in the inevitable and necessary discipline of the battlefield, they were treated as not equals, and that's true. On the other hand, Pompey Elliot, there's a very good, several very good books on Pompey Elliot. Pompey was his nickname, Pompey. And Pompey Elliot, the books are written on, just that Ross McMullen has written the books on Pompey Elliot, and there's no doubt about it, he had intense popularity amongst his soldiers because he did dangerous things. I think it's fair to say that in the First World War, it was rare to find a general who knowingly did a dangerous thing. You may say, well, they're the precious people, they're in charge of making the decisions. Why should they be endangered? But Pompey Elliot won a great reputation as a soldier who was a soldier. Did you see the televised account of the opening of the big Australian War Memorial or Museum at Village Bretneau was it Anzac Day this year? The French Prime Minister, not the French President, the French Prime Minister spoke, one of the best speeches I've ever heard. Did anyone hear it? It was so heartwarming, and his control of English, the choice of words, even with his French accent, was quite moving. He singled out Pompey Elliot as somebody special, and how fortunate the country is to have a Pompey Elliot. He came back, he became a senator in the federal parliament, and he became depressed. Depression, was quite common amongst a percentage of soldiers, probably a small percentage, but big numbers nonetheless. And Pompey Elliot committed suicide. I think while under medical attention, I think he cut a vein in his wrist and died. He was so popular that the authorities for a while didn't want to say that he'd committed suicide being considered in a different light to today, but I think he was a great man. John Monash, without doubt, was a great man. He wouldn't say he was a soldier's soldier, but he was doing what other generals did, planning things brilliantly, but making sure that those who were doing the planning didn't lose their lives, so that the plan would be meaningless if the person in charge of the plan was not there. I think it's fair to say that, I stand correction, I suspect Monash was the most respected man in Australia when he came back from the war, having finished the demobilisation. The most respected man in Australia. Even though he was Jewish, even though he looked slightly foreign, even though he didn't go around slapping people's backs or waiting outside the town hall to shake hands. But I think he was the most respected man in Australia, and the funeral, of course, was an astonishing event, wasn't it? His body was lying in state in Parliament House, and the funeral procession, I think, went down St Kilda Road eventually to the Brighton Cemetery. I think it was the biggest funeral held in Melbourne up to that time. People say, you know, a place in the Human Rights Commission and places like that say Australia is a terrible place for racism and anti-Semitism. How could you have such honour being paid to a soldier by such a huge crowd when people are hostile to that man because of his race? I think a lot of our authorities sell ourselves short as a people. Of course, Australians have bad qualities. We all have bad qualities, but there are many great qualities in the Australian tradition. And Monash wouldn't have been honoured like that in most other countries. It's terrible to have to appear before the Human Rights Commission for a speech made on Armistice Day. I have to say, but it was Armistice Day.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Professor Blainey.